Hey, everybody, welcome to episode 13 or season 2, episode 3, depending on whose side you're on, Nick or mine, for the Functional Firefighter podcast. Today, we got two very special guests. We've got a lot of folks in our department who are going to be testing for chiefs and captain positions. So we thought we'd get a different perspective, something outside the fire service on leadership. So I'm going to go ahead and just start and get our introductions. We've got Mandy Rollins and Susan Upward. We're going to let them each give a little introduction, and we'll start diving into some leadership talk. So, Mandy, would you like to give us an introduction of who you are and what you do?
Sure. Thank you so much, and thanks for having me on your podcast today. So I'm Mandy Rollins. I am an executive leadership coach. I work with primarily senior leaders, and I really enjoy working with people who work in professions where they're helping other people. So I do a lot of work with healthcare providers, with attorneys, nonprofit CEOs, different organizations like that. So both individual coaching as well as doing some training and team coaching as well.
Awesome. And Susan, would you like to give us an introduction of who you are and what you do for a living?
Sure. My name is Susan Upward, and my day job is I'm a lieutenant colonel in the United States Marine Corps. I've been on active duty for 20 years. The first 8 years of that, I enlisted, and then I became an officer and became an air support control officer. So that's my first 2 deployments overseas. We're controlling aircraft, and then I had the opportunity to go to law school. So now my primary function is as a national security and operational law attorney. In my spare time, I also am a formal school instructor, and some of the topics that I teach are military law, law of war, rules of engagement, and then also unconscious bias.
Awesome. Little background, we all met we all are taking class together, and just getting to know them through class. I'm really fascinated by both of what they do, and I feel like this outside perspective could really kind of help our membership inside the fire service. So we're going to get it started. We're just going to kind of bop back and forth with questions. So, Mandy, I'm going to start with you. What differences do you see in different levels of leadership as far as like what do you work on with those? Like more of like you said you deal with more of like a senior and executive leadership. Is there a different need that they have over more of like a mid-level manager or frontline supervisor?
Definitely, yes. So, when I think of a frontline supervisor or frontline manager, someone who's really in a management role for the first time or a leader role for the first time, typically those people have been tapped to be in that role because they're really good at what they do technically, right? Like, so you're a really good paralegal, and all of a sudden now you've been asked to become the manager of the paralegals. Or I know when I was in college, I worked in an exercise physiology lab. I did a really good job with VO2 max testing. And the next year I was asked to be the manager of the lab, right? So really good technical skills. All of a sudden now I've been asked to be the manager. And so for those type of people, it's still important that you have the technical skills because you're working really closely to the work that's being done in the organization, but you also have to learn the leadership in the human skills. So, kind of making that shift from this idea of me to we, that you are going to succeed if your team succeeds. How do you have conversations with people? How do you provide feedback? How do you evaluate the work that's being done? Kind of all of those pieces. And then I see as people rise through organizations or as they move into more senior levels, the technical responsibilities and skill sets aren't as important. The people skill sets continue to be really important. And then building in the conceptual skills. So, when I work with the CEO of a company or when I work with a senior leader in an organization, it's really helping them identify a vision if they don't already have the vision. But once they have that vision in place, then how do you communicate that vision to your team members or your organization? And importantly, how do you help people understand and see how they fit into that vision? So it's really kind of more of that big picture the vision piece, as well as really how are you showing up as a leader, right? So there are specific things you need to get done. I always talk about the what and the how, or the what and the who. So what are the things that you're doing as a leader, which is really important, but how are you showing up? How are you actually getting those things done is the other big piece. So I think the vision piece is important. I think having oftentimes I ask people, like, why do you lead? Why are you a leader? Right? If you don't know why you're leading, how are others going to follow you, or why would you expect them to follow you? So those are some of the differences that I see.
And Susan, do you feel like that's kind of representative in the military? Because I feel like that kind of hit home with us in the fire service.
Yeah, totally. And I should have probably put this in my introduction, but obviously the opinions that I expressed today are my own and not those of the DoD or the Marine Corps. But yes, I completely agree with Mandy. We see leaders, coming up in the ranks. And obviously, in the military, as I'm sure in the fire department, there are leaders at every level, right? And as we see them get into more middle management positions, we see them being really tactically and technically proficient at their jobs, whether it be an infantryman or a paralegal or whatever their military occupational specialty is. But where they struggle sometimes is dealing with people. So when I teach things like unconscious bias, there is usually, definitely in the Marine Corps, there is usually a whoa, what are we talking about here? Because we're really good at closing with and destroying the enemy, projecting our power outward. But when you do the 180 turn and turn around and say, hey, I have to apply leadership skills, not to go take a hill or, make an attack, but to look at how I'm dealing with our personnel, how we do promotions, how we do awards, how we do assignments. That's a really difficult task. And I think sometimes we struggle with that as Marines in the military in general, because we want to think always of how do we project power instead of how do we look at ourselves in order to project power in a better fashion.
So would that be, I guess, some of your challenges then with teaching? I'm sure teaching Marines isn't too different than a room full of firefighters, right? So would that be some of your challenges?
I'm guessing there's a lot of type A personalities in both rooms. Yeah, absolutely. So when you have a first responder combat type mentality, right? We teach a bias for action. We teach, not to think and have that cognitive thought. We teach you how to act and react to situations. And that's good. One of the challenges I have with teaching Marines is they have a bias when you say the word unconscious bias. They have a bias about the word bias itself until you remind them, hey, one of the basic things you learned as a Marine is a bias for action. That's a good bias. You also have to be able to accept that there are bad biases. Not only that, one of the challenges is getting them out of the mindset that everything is a now problem. I'm sure in the fire department, it's the same way. There is operational tempo and there's decisions that need to be made right now. But the reality of those moments where you're in the thick of it and you need to make a decision right now take up very little bit of our time. Let's be honest, 90% of our time, 95% of our time, you have more time to cognitively think about what you're doing. So, one of the challenges I have is getting Marines out of that mindset. You don't need to make a decision right now. I often tell them, hey, let's walk to right. Let's not run to wrong. So let's step back and look at this from a holistic perspective. And then that's how we get into, do we have biases that are at play here? And not explicit biases, because obviously, like the fire department, the Marine Corps, almost every organization, there are rules against having explicit biases. Sure. But are there implicit biases that are happening? Are there cognitive biases that are occurring that we don't even know are happening unless you sit back and reflect on what you're doing and really take the time to think about what you're doing?
And for us, I think kind of in the same world is I want to have a process. Like, I want to have a process to solve problems, right? So like learning about like a theory or something doesn't help me unless I have something to be able to apply it with. Does that make sense? I mean, I'm sure you kind of have the same exact, like I want, that's like when we were in class, like that leader member exchange kind of hit home with me, because now I can see, like, in my team, I have like an in group of people, and then I have an out group, right? And is this out group of their choosing? Are they massive introverts and they come to work, they do their job, but that's who they are? Is they internalize, or not very social, they don't want to be part of the group? Or is it something that I'm doing as a leader to keep them in that out group, or allowing the team to ostracize a member? You know what I'm saying? Like, I want to have a process to be like, hey, I need to look at this. Is that so? Like when you're dealing with Marines, like how do you I guess teach that?
Yeah, it's Marines don't do anything with what I call ditties. So, if you have a mnemonic or something that helps them remember, like, I don't think I can go to the rifle range without, saying treat, never, keep. That's the 4 rules of safety on the rifle range. So, we try to break it down in a way that they would be able to, recall that information quickly. For unconscious bias, the way I teach it is, yes, a lot of that has to do with self-awareness. And the first, part of that is admitting you have bias. And that is a huge step for some people to do. I've absolutely had people come into my class and say, I'm not biased. And by 10 minutes into the class, I get them to a place where they say, oh yeah, I may have bias. And by the end, I give them a mnemonic to remember how to deal with it. And that mnemonic is detect, reflect, reject. So detect the fact that you may have a bias, think about it, reflect on it, and then, hey, I'm not going to make this decision based on that bias. And that simple process opens up a whole world of other cognitive thinking for Marines to think about these problems, to think about how they're making decisions. And again, it's not just how we, close with and destroy the enemy. It's also how we deal with ourselves. And I think that's a much harder, it is much harder for Marines to admit, I may be flawed and I may not even know it. And that flaw may affect how I'm dealing with my fellow Marines, my subordinates, how I make decisions that could affect their lives.
So just from a general standpoint and understanding the development of this, is this something that both of you have seen that organizations or the military will implement either in quarterly training, or is it something that is self-recognized where they come to you and say, hey, I need help? Is it covered in basic training? Is it like a muscle that always needs to be exercised, and understanding that who you are is constantly being developed? How do we get to that point if that is at all possible?
I'll let Mandy go first on that one.
So I think, and it's not specific to unconscious bias, but I think some of the things that Susan was talking about really are some tools that we leverage and use in coaching as well. So the first thing that I heard and that I talk to with all of my clients about is when they bring a problem is looking in the mirror, right? And figuring out what part of this problem do you own as the leader, which many people don't like to look in that mirror. But that's the first step that you can take. The other thing that I heard Susan talking about, I would call perspective taking. So, looking at a situation, okay, here's my perspective on it. All right, now let's start looking at different perspectives. And so really, I think one of the important things with a leader is that you are able to adapt to the situation. And I feel like part of that adaptability or agility is to be able to look at a situation, look at a problem, from these different perspectives. And then really from the different perspectives, choose what perspective is going to best help me move forward here and take that action. And maybe it's a combination of those perspectives, but even just taking that time, and I think Susan, you touched on this too, that not everything has to be solved immediately, but taking that time to think, to reflect, to look at things from different perspectives, and then consciously make a choice of what's the perspective you're going to solve the problem with and how to move forward.
And I think that, the way I discuss it with Marine, I know this is going to come as a shock, but Marines spend a lot of time in the gym. So when I talk to them about leadership being like a muscle, right? It has to be worked. It's not something you can just say, oh, I took a leadership class, I'm a leader now. It is a constant process of improvement. And there is going to be times where you're going to come up with different situations that you're going to have to use different muscles, right? So we do discuss this. When I first started teaching this, it was at the basic school, which is the basic officer training course for all officers in the Marine Corps. I taught there for 2 years when I was the staff judge advocate there. And then I'm actually going back this fall to teach there as a guest instructor. But this subject, UB, or other subjects of leadership, obviously is taught at these very entry level stages. The problem is, I don't think we do a very good job of following up on it, right? We don't do a very good job of making sure, hey, are these people getting leadership touch points throughout their career? Now we do, I'm sure the fire department does the same thing where they have, continuing education or career courses, and they do discuss leadership there. But actually taking the time in those leadership courses where it's not death by PowerPoint, but actually having like real solid discussion, and then also self-reflection. Can't agree with Mandy more. Having them actually look in the mirror and say, hey, how do others perceive my leadership? What's working for me as a leader? What's not working for me as a leader? Is there something I can do differently? I think we could do in a lot of organizations, not just the military, a better job of doing that throughout somebody's career life cycle to make sure they have those touch points along the way.
Is there anything? Oh, sorry.
Oh, I was just going to say, I think too, that's where the beauty of coaching can come in as well. Right? Because as I come in as a coach, I'm not a technical expert on things. However, I can work with people and be that accountability, right? We do a lot of work in coaching around holding people accountable to doing what they say they're going to do, but also using coaching as a way to experiment. Okay, how might you approach this situation? How might you solve this problem? Who might you engage? And then let them try it and come back, and then we debrief, and then we talk about other scenarios. And so it's really that way, like Susan said, it's not just you go to a class and then all of a sudden you're a leader, but how are you getting that reinforcement over time?
Well, Mandy, what are some drills you do then with new leadership to hold people accountable? Because that's what a lot of our folks are about to have to start doing. Is that's tough, right? That's a tough part of being a leader, is calling people out and making sure that you hold them accountable. So what are some drills that you do with your clients in your world?
I would say, so first of all, so we use a lot of tools to do that, if you will, right? So we're always talking about on our coaching calls, okay, what are we going to focus on today? What do you want to get out of today's session? We capture action items. We have tools that we use to track those. And they know that on our next call, we're going to go back first thing and go through, here's what you said you were going to do. Did you get this done? Yes or no? If it's yes, what enabled you to get it done? If it's no, what stopped you from getting it done? Is this still important? Are you going to continue working on it? And so building tools like that, we can, you really just create this little machine of accountability. And then typically what those leaders do is they'll bring those type of tools to their team, right? So how many of you have been in a meeting, you talk about all the things that are going to happen, no one writes it down, or it is written down, and then you come back, next week for the meeting and no one even follows up. Did those things happen? So really getting specific in meetings, documenting action items and following up on those, one-on-one meetings, documenting what's going to happen and following up on those. It's really, I've found the best way to hold people accountable.
Nice.
That was going to button up. That's what I was going to ask prior when Susan had mentioned getting that perceived leadership. If there was any of those tools in place, if there are evaluations, required face-to-face meetings or anonymous. If anonymous feedback seems to be more honest for some odd reason, but if that's something that's in place that you all practice.
Well, I can tell you the Marine Corps, I think it was approximately 2 years ago, maybe a little less than 2 years ago, instituted a pilot program for 360-degree feedback, or fitness reports, as we call them, where select leaders would send out an anonymous survey to certain subordinates to get feedback on that. And it's kind of changed as far as form and function in the Marine Corps, but I think we're seeing that more in organizations. What that is used for, I think some people were concerned that was going to be used for promotions or whether somebody should move up in leadership was, 360-degree feedback. And I think, let me be honest, 360-degree feedback has its own issues. You can find people that maybe have an airing of a grievance that will rate somebody down on a 360-degree feedback because they feel this person is a poor leader because I was treated poorly. And it has nothing to do really with their leadership style. So there is some, there is some flex there that you have to be cognizant of, that somebody may have a bias that has nothing to do with the leadership at all. But I do think that organizations, including the military, are going towards more of this type of 360-degree feedback. The other thing we use that is already in place and has been in place for years is called the Command Climate Survey. And this is used throughout the military. It is a survey that goes out to the entire population of a unit, whether that's a squadron or a battalion or a regiment, whatever the size of the unit is, where people have the opportunity to talk about certain issues. They can, the commanders can ask about EO issues. They can ask about command climate. They can ask about leadership. Totally anonymous. And it comes back in a report to the commander where they can see those issues. So we find that those types of programs help with, again, if you're just looking at leadership through the eyes of a peer or superior to a subordinate, it's different from that subordinate on the way up.
And I don't love anonymous feedback. And I know for different organizations, especially size of organizations, sometimes that's like how it has to happen. But I just feel like not all feedback should be considered equal, right? If you have people that are really accountable, if you have people that are really looking to grow and learn and move the organization forward, like people that are bought in, that are aligned with the culture, that are doing the things that need to be done, and really care, like that feedback is important. If you have people that are just kind of checked out or not on board, or, I just don't feel like all feedback should be considered equal.
We see that in our, we do it with our recruits. We get feedback for that's the last time we'll do feedback is during our courses when we have instructors during our academies. I've never seen a bad instructor or a bad evaluation. And it's been probably 40 or 50 classes and everybody is money. So, I mean, maybe we are that good. I don't, maybe not.
No, it's 100% where you have all the power and they just fear reporting poorly. So I guess it's kind of the opposite of what you're talking about, Mandy, but we've talked about this. There's a lot of Fortune 500 companies will send out surveys of problems that they have to their frontline workers because they're the ones who deal with the problem. And then they also send out a survey of possible solutions for those frontline problems. And they end up using them a lot of times because the people who are making the decisions of the problems aren't the people dealing with the problems. So I kind of think that there's I never even thought about using it as far as like evaluating leadership. But I feel like there's like this huge disconnect, especially with us. And I'm sure you see it in corporate, and Susan, I'm sure you see it in the military. There's this huge disconnect with the people who are doing the task and the people with the vision of where to move the machine forward, So like having some open lines of communication would be pretty important. So Susan, when you're teaching like in an implicit bias class to a bunch of Marines, like what's your hook? Like how do you open up? And I asked because like I had an inclusive excellence class in my master's program, and I hate to even admit this, I didn't know what inclusive excellence was. It was a sports psychology degree, so I thought it was like something to do with like including disabled people into sports. You know what I mean? Like that's where I thought it was, because there was another disabled, like a Paralympic psychology and psychology of the injured athlete, inclusive excellence was all branched together. And the first report, or the first journal article that I read was, stereotypes and prejudice are committed by people in positions of power to control narratives for their own personal gain, right? Which I can get behind. Like that makes sense in my head. And then the next line was, this is perpetrated by white males, right? So for me, like instantly, I'm like, I put my defenses up, because I'm like, that doesn't speak for me, right? That's like a hard thing to like look and say, like, what do I have biases towards? Especially when I'm defensive initially from like the first 5 minutes into class, you know what I mean? Because like, I don't want to be put in that out group, essentially. I don't want to be part of the problem, right? So how do you deal with Marines? Because I'm sure that they're probably of a similar mindset, right?
Yeah, it's a great question, because like I talked about, there is definitely a bias about this topic, right? You hear implicit bias, unconscious bias, and immediately there's a visceral reaction to it, because it's been linked to always about race, always about gender, somehow linked to critical race theory, which is completely not true. So the way I usually start classes, and I usually take the temperature of the room. I insist on teaching this class in person. So just as a side note, when I was teaching this at Quantico was during COVID. And the majority of classes for the lieutenants at that time went online. This was one of the classes that we taught in person. I insisted that it be taught in person because it does not usually play well over a VTC, video conferencing, Zoom. It just doesn't play well. I have to be in the room with the people to get a feel for the room. So, I will pick something that I think will get them to hook that they are aware of. So an easy one is, when I say peanut butter, you say jelly. Right? Most people will say jelly. Some people will say cookies. Yeah. You may have some Marines that are like peanut butter shots, but somehow they make a connection, right? They make a connection to that. And then I ask them, why? Why does your brain make that connection? And they say, well, ma'am, it's good together. Yeah, but why do you know it's good together? And the reality is, your brain is lazy. It likes to take shortcuts. It likes to make cognitive decisions without you even being aware of it. So before you even cognitively thought, hey, what goes with peanut butter? What would I say when you say peanut butter? You say jelly, because that's the shortcut your brain makes. That's where cognitive bias comes from. It's not that is a fact. It is not that is true. Yes, some people would say peanut butter and jelly go good together. It's a fact that at some point in your life, somebody gave you a peanut butter sandwich, whether it was your mom or your dad or your parole officer. I don't know who it was. Somebody gave you a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, and you decided it was good. And now your brain makes that shortcut. So that's usually the hook. And then from there, I usually talk about when without fail, in a room of 300 lieutenants, who's a football fan? Okay, so when I say Dallas Cowboys, who has an emotional reaction to Dallas Cowboys fans? Who puts Dallas Cowboys fans all in the same bucket? They all look the same, think the same, that kind of thing. And once you get people to think about it in kind of these non-offensive ways, like, hey, yeah, I do think this way about Dallas Cowboys fans, or I do think this way about peanut butter and jelly. Or even that when you started, you said that this was episode 13. I would have used that as a hook and said, who had a reaction to, oh my God, it's number 13, right? Because your brain makes that shortcut. So once you get them there and they're like, oh yeah, my brain does make that shortcuts. That's when I get into, if you believe and you've now seen that your brain makes these shortcuts, can you see how this could apply to race, gender, military specialties, branches of the military? Do we think all Marine Corps officers are the same? Do we think everybody from the Air Force plays golf all day? Do we make those connections because our brain makes those shortcuts because at some point we were taught that? And that's the kind of cognitive bias that we're trying to fight against. So that's usually how I get Marines there. I don't know if they get all the way there, but they at least understand what I'm talking about.
That's awesome. Susan, that's awesome. Mandy, do you have like a similar kind of issue, I guess, with in the corporate world with leadership?
You know, not specifically. I would say the one thing that I see in the corporate setting is that everyone wants to know the answer. So like even when someone finds out, or the first time that I talk to someone and they know I'm a leadership coach, the first question is, well, what's the best type of leadership? Just tell me and I'll do that. And, you know, I feel like as we've gone through and as you look at all of these different leadership theories and how they've evolved over time, you know, my answer is always, well, it depends. And it feels like that's a cop-out, but it really is, it does depend. It depends on what is the profession you're in, what is the environment, you know, what are the challenges that you're dealing with, what is your role, what is the culture of the organization, right? Is it, in kind of what stage of business are you in? Are you, you know, is your business rapidly evolving? Have you had tremendous growth? Are you really focused on bringing in new business? Are you focused on kind of building your team? So I feel like there is this desire for a silver bullet, like this, everyone wants the answer. This is the best type of leadership. Here are the skills you need. Now just like go do it. But there are so many great lines in there. And it's just really figuring out. I mean, most of coaching is asking questions. And asking enough questions so people can do that reflection and figure out really what's important to them.
Yeah, that's both of you have given a bunch of like good points and insight to kind of this like really hard problem of which is leadership, right? And I think just real quick, Mandy, do you see certain types of leadership working better in different levels? Like, do you see like that frontline supervisor being something versus, or that mid-level manager or that executive staff, a certain type of leadership that comes out? I know you just said everybody wants an answer. I'm trying to ask for an answer, but
you know, as we look at all of the different leadership theories and you know, these things that we've been studying in class, and then when you just look practically, like what's being implemented, I feel like this willingness to continuously learn and adapt is one of the most important skills of any leader, right? So whether you're a frontline leader and you are onboarding new team members, right? You need to be more directive. You need to tell them what to do. You need to set expectations. At some point, as they start to do it, you need to be able to support them and give feedback and do, you know, some corrective actions in things like that. As you grow in your leadership skills, you know, you're not leading other people doing technical things. So then it really is important that you're able to inspire people and get them behind you. You know, thinking of like transformative leadership, or again, adaptive leadership, authentic leadership. Again, that idea of what is your purpose? Why are you leading? If you can't answer that, why should anyone follow you? You know, really getting clear on what are your core values, and then how are you behaving? Is your behavior aligned with those values? How are you building relationships with people? You know, do you have self-discipline? Do you show up consistently? And then finally, do you, you know, have the heart to lead, and not like heart rainbows and butterflies, but, you know, do you care about the people you're leading? Do you care about the cause that you're leading for? Do you have that compassion? So I feel like really looking at it holistically, you know, are you showing up as you? And some leaders don't know who they are, and that's one of the most important things for them to figure out.
And I can,
sorry,
go ahead.
Sorry. No, go ahead, Susan.
Well, I was going to touch upon the fact that, you know, I think Mandy makes a great point there about finding out who you are as a leader. but then also remembering it's a relationship. So it's not one size fits all for every type of follower, right? Just the same way you guys don't fight every single fire the exact same way every single time. That's the same approach you have to take to leadership. Not every leadership tactic you have in the book will work with every follower you have. You have to find the right tool. And I think sometimes, especially in the military, we like things uniform, right? Like, isn't it A Few Good Men that says, somewhere there's a pamphlet or a book that tells me exactly how to get to the chow hall? We like that. We like that, that mentality. But that's not how leadership works. It cannot be a checklist. It cannot be, hey, I have all of these traits checked off on my list, therefore I'm a good leader. It's a relationship, and it's a symbiotic relationship that will change over time. And I think leaders really have to change, especially in hierarchical, organizations where it's I'm leading, you following, I'm telling you what to do, have to change their mentality that leadership all the time is not always the answer. You have to be flexible in how you lead.
And I just had a thought, just wanted to see what you two kind of reflecting on my personal thought process on this, just listening to you two. And then also with the previous episode, we spoke with one of our chiefs and the importance of having grace and understanding that mistakes are going to happen. Because it sounds like once you understand that growth is a process, that it is a muscle and there's going to be multiple muscles, every situation's different, every person's different, there's personalities and problems are complex. So once you commit yourself to being the best that you could possibly be, you've now done that 180. You're reflecting, you're still going to make mistakes. And I think that, to me, that's the hard part of, okay, I've done this, I've turned it, and I can't fix this Rubik's Cube, or this one particular person I can't figure out, or I stepped in it today. I think being able to understand that you're going to make mistakes no matter how much you commit yourself to your improvement. Every situation is going to be complicated, and to have some grace for yourself. I think that's a big overarching component of this. I just wanted to see if that's something that you two share or have seen or have experience with.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think, especially in the Marine Corps, we say make mistakes now so we don't make them in battle. The fire department is the same way. There are certain times where mistakes will cost people their lives, right? And that is a reality that we live with every single day. That is the burden of being a leader in this type of organization. But by the same token, I think leaders have to have the empathy to understand not every mistake is fatal. So if we have a zero defect mentality where every mistake is like the worst thing that's ever happened in the world, people are not going to grow. They're also not going to take risks that they need to grow. So it's our job as leaders to make sure that we have empathy, that we understand that mistakes are going to happen. We just need to make sure the big mistake doesn't happen. And the way you do that is by having the smaller mistakes that are leading up to whatever it is, whatever the bigger crisis that is coming down the pike.
Yeah, Susan, I agree with that. I would add on as well is that I think it's really important that leaders are willing to talk about their mistakes, right? Because if you normalize that, if you have those discussions, if you make the mistake and then you debrief that mistake with your team, you talk through it, there's a lot of learning that can happen there too. And I feel like it's important for leaders to be humble, to be able to talk about, to have transparency, and kind of set the stage or be a role model for others in the organization as well, that yes, these things are going to happen. Let's talk about it. Let's learn, and let's ensure it doesn't happen again.
And I think it's important to note that being a role model does not equate being perfect. I think sometimes we look at being a role model as you have to be, on a pedestal that people have to, to copy every single thing that you do because you're perfect. And I think that's where we make mistakes as leaders is that you do not have to be perfect to be a role model. And I totally agree with Mandy. Admitting your mistakes is a big part of that.
Well, I think that was awesome. I think this whole episode so far has been just a huge nugget for everybody in our organization who's going to be testing here in a couple weeks. What we normally do with the show is, and we forgot to do it last episode, but normally we do like a little clip of the week. And we just like watch a clip and then we kind of talk about it. If y'all have a couple more minutes, we'll have our technician here put it up on the screen.
Yeah.
I'm ready.
Love Ted Lasso.
We just kind of talk about any relevance to the discussion we had. So like, and I mean, this one's pretty obvious. I think in our world now, we get a lot of talk about this new generation, right? So for us, the new generation, whether it's they don't work or they're massively introverted or whatever, I think that there's something to, and I don't even necessarily know if it's their fault, right? But like I see it quite a bit, and you go into a firehouse, you'll have, some of the younger cats will be on their phones, kind of not necessarily in that out group completely, but isolated, not engaged. And that's one of the times that I kind of try to like get to know those people, because I just feel like social interactions, I guess, harder for them, right? I don't know if you've ever experienced that, or if it's kind of similar in the Marine Corps or in corporate worlds, but I feel like just trying to get people to come out of their shell a little bit, just to get to know who they are, is kind of part of bringing them into that in-group.
Yeah, I try to reframe the issue. I think in-person social interaction is different for them. I think social interaction takes a different form for them, right? So, and let me start by saying the Marine Corps is infamous for, the people in Korea were like, oh, the new generation coming up, and same in Vietnam, and same in Persian Gulf One, and same now, right? So we go through this generational thing time after time again, like, oh, they didn't have to, march uphill 10 miles carrying the entire platoon on their back, or whatever it may be. So I think there's some bias there, as far as that's an easy way to say, hey, these people look at things differently than I do. But I always try to reframe that with my junior Marines that come to me and say, hey, ma'am, I can't get a hold of this Marine because they're always in their phone, or they interact differently. And I think that's part of the challenge of being a leader, is exactly like you said. How do you sit down and actually connect with them? And does that mean connecting with them over text? Does that mean connecting with them in a chat room? A lot of them play video games and are constantly in social circles on these video games. They're not actually seeing people, but it is a social connection for them because they're talking as they're playing the video games. So I think a lot of it has to do with reframing how we think about social interactions, and then how we draw that person out. Because I got to tell you, the new generation is way smarter than I am. And it has a lot of technical skills that I couldn't even possibly. You're lucky I even got on this call today without my computer blowing up. Like, they know how to do things that I just couldn't do. But it's a matter of drawing them out. And that's what I have to do as a leader, is figure out, hey, what I did as a leader, 15 years ago in Fallujah may not work in Cherry Point, North Carolina today, because they come from a different background, but I have to value that perspective that they have.
So you constantly have to be curious.
Right. I have an admission to make here on this podcast, is that I've never seen one episode of Ted Lasso.
Me neither.
I just watched it for the first time last month, so I was late.
Yeah.
Well, Mandy,
I was disappointed
Mandy
in myself.
just judged us.
Ted Lasso diehard. I'm feeling so sorry for all of you that haven't seen it because it is so good.
Yeah. I mean, speaking of leadership, that is, I mean, Mandy, correct me if I'm wrong. I mean, there are so many throughout that entire, all 3 seasons. There's some leadership stuff in there, some nuggets in there that are awesome.
That's what I've heard.
There could be a graduate school class just on Ted Lasso. But I think, the thing that struck me in that video clip too, and as I reflect on leaders that I work with, is if a leader gets to a point where they feel like they know the answer, or that they just know that, like, they think they don't have to think about something as they go into a situation or a negotiation, like they've got it. That is the key. Okay, you need to stop and you need to reflect. You need to get curious. Like, if you're feeling that confident that you've got it, that you're set, that should be the trigger to stop and reflect and think and get curious.
Awesome.
You got anything, Nick?
Nope, that'll do it. Thank you both so much for joining us.
I can't thank you two enough.
This was
like
awesome.
I said, I was fascinated with you two in class. Look forward to hopefully having some more classes with you in the next. I don't know when either. When do you both graduate? When are you both done?
I defend in fall of next year, but I'm taking the summer off so that I can go to France for 3 weeks.
Nice.
I still have time.
Yeah, I think I'm scheduled to defend next fall, so we'll see what happens, but we'll see if there's any holdup. But like I said, I look forward to hopefully having more class and interaction with you, and I can't thank you two enough. I think your time here has been invaluable. I think it's going to really help, especially our membership, who's trying to scramble and figure out this new career that they're going to have, hopefully. So thank you two so much. And that'll do it for us.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys. It was fun.
See you later. All righty.
Bye.